It may feel like you and this person are meant to be together, but there is something important unfolding first. Pause for a moment and breathe. If this message has reached you today, it's not random, it isn't just chance or an algorithm placing it in front of you. Something within you was already searching for it, and life simply responded. Close your eyes and bring them to mind. Notice what rises in your chest, the pull, the ache, the warmth, the intensity that feels both beautiful and overwhelming. That is not confusion, it is recognition. Your heart already understands what your mind is still trying to explain. This person isn't just someone you crossed paths with. There is a deeper familiarity your soul recognizes, even if you can't explain it yet. I know how heavy this kind of love feels when timing is wrong and uncertainty lingers. There is something no one prepares you for about relationships that transform your life. They are not meant to make you comfortable. They are meant to make you whole. And wholeness always comes with discomfort. Think of the strongest things in nature. Diamonds formed under pressure. Pearls created inside wounds. Sunrise after the darkest night. This connection is shaping both of you in the same way, even if you cannot yet see how. One of you is learning that love does not require shrinking yourself to be accepted. The other is learning that closeness does not mean losing freedom. One gives endlessly until empty, hoping it will finally be enough. The other pulls away, not because there is no feeling, but because the feeling is overwhelming. Beneath all of it, both are trying to protect hearts that were hurt before. But here is the part that changes everything. I need you to stay with this. Every deeply meaningful connection reaches a turning point. A moment so subtle it can be missed entirely. It does not come through grand apologies or perfect words from them. It begins within you, the moment you decide to stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself. When that shift happens, everything in the dynamic begins to move differently. Not because love is magical, but because it reflects energy. When you stop fear and desperation, the space between you changes. When you no longer chase from anxiety, there is nothing for the other person to retreat from. And in that stillness, they are left alone with what they actually feel. Not fear, not defense, but truth. That truth has never disappeared. It has only been buried. Stay with me, because what comes next will help make sense of what you've been carrying. Let this sink in. You haven't been waiting for nothing. Every night you spent loving someone who wasn't there wasn't wasted. Love doesn't work like that. And every tear you cried when nothing made sense wasn't weakness. It was your heart refusing to shut down what felt meaningful. That ability to keep feeling even when it hurt says something powerful about you. You could have closed off, become guarded, decided it was too painful to stay open, but you didn't. You stayed soft in a world that often rewards emotional distance. And that softness isn't fragility, it's strength. Because the kind of love you're capable of holding is the kind that can become real, stable and lasting when the timing aligns. Now here is the shift that changes everything. You start turning back toward yourself with the same energy you once poured into them. Not in anger, not in giving up, but in care. You begin asking what you need today, not what might bring them closer, not what could fix the distance, but what supports you right now. You fill the spaces you left empty while waiting. Slowly, you stop living like someone unfinished and start becoming someone whole. And that wholeness changes your presence. It's not a strategy, it's a byproduct of self-respect. People feel it, even without words, and so does the person you care about most. But understand this too, they are not a villain. What looks like distance is fear that existed long before you arrived. You cannot heal that for them, no matter how deeply you feel. And then there is the future you cannot yet fully see but is already forming. One day you will wake up and realize the ache has softened, not because you stopped loving, but because love has finally found its place. You will look back and understand yourself differently, with compassion instead of confusion. And if this connection returns in its healed form, it will feel steady, mutual and calm, not chaotic or uncertain. That is the kind of love being shaped through this season. So don't lose yourself in the waiting. You are not behind, not broken, not late. You are becoming. Every moment you choose yourself is part of that transformation. What most people don't realize in connections like this is that intensity is not the same thing as destiny, but it often feels that way because it activates something very deep inside the nervous system. When someone feels both close and unavailable at the same time, the mind starts filling in the gaps with meaning, hope, and future potential. That doesn't make the feeling fake. It just means it's being shaped by uncertainty as much as by love. And uncertainty has a way of keeping emotional attention locked in place. This is why the connection can feel so consuming, because your mind keeps trying to solve something that doesn't yet have clarity. The real shift begins when you stop trying to decode every signal and instead observe what the dynamic is actually doing to your emotional state day by day, not just what it feels like in your most hopeful moments. There is also something important happening beneath the surface that often gets overlooked. These kinds of bonds don't just activate attachment, they also activate identity. You start to see yourself through the lens of how they respond to you, and over time that can quietly replace how you naturally see yourself. When they are close, you feel worthy. When they are distant, you question yourself. That emotional dependency on their presence is what makes the connection feel larger than life. But the turning point is when you begin to separate your sense of value from their availability, not by forcing detachment, but by slowly rebuilding your internal reference point. You start asking, who am I when I'm not being chosen or not being ignored? That question begins to bring you back to yourself in a way no relationship alone can define. And something subtle starts to change when that inner shift begins. You stop interpreting silence as rejection and start seeing it as information. You stop romanticizing inconsistency and start noticing how your body actually feels inside it. That awareness doesn't kill love, but it does remove illusion. What remains is something clearer, more grounded, and more honest. If a connection is real and healthy, it will survive clarity. If it only survives confusion, then it was never truly stable to begin with. Either way, you begin to step out of emotional guessing and into emotional truth. And from that place, your decisions become less about longing and more about alignment. That is where real peace starts to form, not in getting answers from them, but in no longer needing them to define your emotional reality. What also becomes clearer over time is that emotional attachment can sometimes outgrow the actual relationship itself. You are not only reacting to who the person is in the present moment, but also to everything your mind has attached to them, the imagined future, the potential, the what-if version that feels more complete than reality. That's why letting go can feel so painful, even when the situation itself is inconsistent. You're not just grieving a person, you're grieving an entire inner world that formed around them. And that's why logic alone rarely helps in these situations. The heart is not responding to facts, it is responding to meaning, but meaning can evolve. When you begin to step back and observe instead of emotionally merging, something important happens. You start noticing patterns instead of moments. You see not just how strongly you feel, but how stable the experience actually is. And stability matters more than intensity when it comes to real emotional safety. A connection that constantly pulls you into anxiety, confusion, and overthinking is not offering the kind of foundation that allows love to grow in a healthy direction. This doesn't require you to force yourself to stop caring. It simply requires you to see the full picture without filtering it through hope alone. And slowly, your emotional system begins to recalibrate. The highs don't feel as intoxicating, and the lows don't feel as devastating. That in-between space is where clarity starts to form. You begin to realize that real love doesn't require you to constantly interpret, decode, or wait. It feels more direct, more consistent, more emotionally safe even when challenges exist. And this realization can feel unsettling at first because it breaks the fantasy loop. But it also gives you something far more valuable, emotional grounding. From that grounding, your choices begin to shift naturally. You stop chasing moments of reassurance and start valuing consistency. You stop building meaning from absence and start responding to presence. And most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself in order to stay emotionally connected to someone else. That is where the quiet transformation happens, not in cutting off feelings, but in no longer letting those feelings override your self-awareness. As you go deeper into this awareness, you also start to see how much of your emotional energy was being spent trying to maintain something that wasn't being equally maintained on the other side. Not because the other person is inherently wrong or malicious, but because mutual readiness is often the missing piece people overlook. Two people can care deeply and still not be able to meet each other in a stable way if their emotional capacities are in different places. One may be reaching for connection, while the other is still learning how to stay present within it. And that mismatch creates the cycle of closeness and distance that feels so confusing and addictive. What changes everything is when you stop trying to bridge that gap alone. Because love cannot be carried by one nervous system. It has to be shared in effort, consistency, and emotional availability. When that balance is missing, the mind often tries harder to compensate, hoping that more understanding, more patience, or more love will eventually create stability. But real stability is not something you earn through endurance. It is something that is co-created when both people are capable of showing up in a grounded way. Without that, even the deepest feelings end up getting lost in uncertainty. And as you begin to accept that truth, something inside you softens in a different way, not into longing, but into clarity. You stop personalizing the inconsistency. You stop believing that if you just adjust yourself enough, the dynamic will finally settle. Instead, you start to see that emotional availability is not something you can negotiate into existence. It either exists or it doesn't. And that realization is not about giving up on love, it's about releasing the burden of trying to force alignment where it is not currently present. From here, your relationship with love itself begins to change. You become less focused on intensity and more attuned to emotional steadiness. You start recognizing that the healthiest connections don't require you to constantly question where you stand. They give you space to simply be without overthinking every interaction. And that shift, although quiet, is powerful, because once you experience clarity, even briefly, you can no longer fully unsee what confusion used to cost you. And when that awareness fully settles in, you begin to notice something even deeper, how much of your inner world was shaped by waiting for replies, waiting for effort, waiting for clarity, waiting for consistency that never fully arrived. Over time, waiting can start to feel like love itself, when in reality, it is often just uncertainty stretched over time. And the longer you stay in that state, the more your emotional attention becomes trained to prioritize potential instead of presence. You begin investing in what could happen rather than what is actually happening right now. But presence is where truth lives. Not in the imagined version of someone, not in the emotional highs of rare moments, but in the steady pattern of how someone shows up when nothing is being forced. When you start grounding yourself in that reality, you slowly detach from the emotional pull of anticipation. You stop measuring love by how strongly it makes you feel in certain moments and start measuring it by how safely it allows you to exist across all moments. That shift may feel subtle at first, but it changes everything about how you relate to connection. And as that shift deepens, you also begin reclaiming parts of yourself that were quietly placed on hold, the parts of you that were waiting to feel chosen, waiting to feel secure, waiting to feel certain before fully living again. You start realizing how much life was being paused in the background of emotional uncertainty, and little by little you begin to unpause it. You return to your routines, your interests, your sense of direction, not as a distraction, but as a reconnection with yourself. In that reconnection, something stabilizes internally. The emotional intensity that once felt overwhelming starts to lose its control over your decisions. You still care, but you are no longer being carried by that care. And that is where real strength begins to form. Not in shutting feelings down, but in no longer letting them override your self-direction. From there, love stops being something you chase and starts becoming something you recognize only when it is aligned, mutual and steady. And as this inner stability grows, your understanding of love itself begins to mature in a very quiet but powerful way. You start realizing that real connection is not built on emotional intensity alone, but on consistency that does not fluctuate with mood, fear, or distance. The relationships that truly support you are not the ones that leave you guessing where you stand, but the ones that make your emotional reality feel steady even in silence. That steadiness becomes more valuable than any temporary rush of feeling, because it gives you space to breathe without overanalyzing every moment. You also begin to see how much energy was previously going into interpretation, reading between lines, decoding behavior, analyzing tone, replaying conversations in your mind. That constant mental activity is not love itself, it is what uncertainty creates when clarity is missing, and when you finally step out of that cycle, you notice how much quieter your mind becomes. Not because you care less, but because you are no longer trying to solve something that was never fully communicated in the first place. At the same time, your emotional boundaries start to strengthen without force. You no longer feel the same urgency to overgive in order to maintain connection. You begin to understand that genuine relationships do not require self-abandonment to survive, and that realization slowly changes how you show up. You become more grounded, more selective with your energy, more aware of what reciprocation actually feels like instead of what you hope it could feel like. And in that grounded state, something very important happens. The idea of love shifts from something that pulls you into emotional turbulence to something that adds stability to your life. You stop associating love with confusion and start associating it with clarity. And once you experience even a glimpse of that clarity within yourself, you begin to realize you were never meant to live in emotional uncertainty as a permanent state. As this clarity deepens even further, you start to understand something that changes your entire emotional foundation. Love is not supposed to cost you your peace. It is not supposed to keep your nervous system in a constant state of anticipation, analysis, or emotional waiting. When it does, it doesn't necessarily mean the feeling isn't real, but it does mean the structure around it is not yet healthy enough to hold it safely. And that distinction is what many people miss while they are still inside the experience. You begin to notice that real emotional safety feels quiet. It does not require constant reassurance or decoding. It does not disappear and reappear in ways that keep you guessing. Instead, it creates a sense of steadiness where your attention can rest rather than stay alert. And when you contrast that with what you were experiencing before, the difference becomes very clear in your body, not just your thoughts. Your mind may have been holding on to hope, but your body was often reacting to stress, uncertainty, and emotional inconsistency. And as that awareness grows, you slowly stop romanticizing what drains you. Not because you are forcing yourself to detach, but because your internal standards begin to rise naturally. You start valuing emotional availability over potential. You start valuing consistency over intensity. You start valuing how someone makes your life feel overall, not just how they make certain moments feel. That shift is subtle, but it is life-changing because it redefines what you are willing to normalize in your relationships. From that place, your choices become quieter but far more intentional. You are no longer chasing clarity from someone who cannot provide it consistently. You are building clarity within yourself first. And once you have that, you stop needing to emotionally overextend just to feel secure in a connection. You begin to understand that the most important relationship you will ever stabilize is the one you have with your own emotional truth. And once you start living from that emotional truth, something very subtle but profound begins to shift in how you experience connection altogether. You no longer feel the same urgency to interpret everything someone does or doesn't do. The emotional spikes that once pulled you into overthinking begin to lose their grip. Not because you are becoming indifferent, but because you are becoming anchored in yourself. And that anchoring changes everything about what you allow to affect your peace. You also start to recognize how often your previous emotional state was shaped by anticipation rather than reality. The waiting, the hoping, the imagining of what could happen next, all of it carried more emotional weight than what was actually happening in the present moment. And when you see that clearly, you begin to gently step out of the cycle of projection. You stop feeding energy into outcomes that are not yet real, and return your focus to what is actually consistent and present in your life. In that process, your sense of self begins to stabilize in a way that does not depend on external validation. You stop measuring your worth by someone else's responsiveness or emotional availability. Instead, you start recognizing your value as something inherent, not something granted or withheld by another person. And that recognition slowly dissolves the emotional dependency that once made certain connections feel overwhelming. From here, love starts to take on a different meaning entirely. It is no longer something that consumes your thoughts or destabilizes your emotions. It becomes something that either complements your life or does not fit into it. And with that clarity, you begin to move differently. Not from attachment or fear, but from self-respect and emotional alignment. And when you reach this stage of understanding, you start to see how much emotional energy was once invested in trying to fix uncertainty instead of simply recognizing it. You were not just feeling love, you were actively trying to stabilize something that was never stable to begin with. That effort often comes from a very sincere place, a desire to understand, to connect, to make things work. But over time, it can quietly turn into emotional exhaustion when it is not met with equal grounding from the other side. What begins to change now is your relationship with effort itself. You stop equating more effort with better outcomes in emotionally inconsistent situations. Instead, you start noticing that effort without reciprocity does not create closeness, it creates depletion. And once you understand that at a deeper level, you no longer romanticize the struggle of holding on, you begin to see that peace is not found in trying harder, but in recognizing when mutual effort is absent. And as this awareness settles in, your emotional reactions also begin to soften. The highs no longer feel like something you have to chase, and the lows no longer feel like something you have to survive. You start to experience a more balanced internal state, where your emotional well-being is no longer tied to unpredictable external behavior. That balance gives you space to think more clearly, choose more wisely, and respond instead of react. From that space, Love becomes something you observe with discernment rather than something you lose yourself inside. You start valuing how consistently someone shows up, how safely you feel in their presence, and how much emotional clarity they bring into your life. And slowly, without force, your entire standard for connection rises to match the stability you are now building within yourself. And as your standards rise naturally, you begin to notice something very important. You are no longer as easily pulled into emotional extremes. Where there used to be urgency, there is now space. Where there used to be confusion, there is now observation. You are still capable of deep feeling, but you are no longer being carried away by it. That difference may seem small, but it completely changes how you relate to love, because you are no longer abandoning yourself inside it. You also start to understand that real connection does not require emotional guessing. It does not keep you in a loop of interpreting silence or overanalyzing small signals for meaning. Instead, it communicates in a way that feels direct and steady. And when you contrast that with what once felt so consuming, you begin to see how much energy was being spent trying to fill in what was never clearly expressed. That realization brings a quiet kind of relief, because it frees you from needing to constantly figure everything out. And in that freedom, something very grounding starts to develop. You become more present in your own life again. Your attention is no longer fully tied to someone else's behavior or unpredictability. You begin reconnecting with your own direction, your own routines, your own sense of identity outside of emotional dependency. That reconnection slowly rebuilds your inner stability in a way no external reassurance ever could. From that place, love stops being something that defines your emotional state and starts becoming something you consciously choose based on alignment. You no longer stay in dynamics that drain your clarity or disrupt your peace. Instead, you move toward experiences that support your growth, your calmness, and your sense of self. And that is where emotional maturity truly begins, not in losing feeling, but in no longer losing yourself inside it. And when that emotional maturity continues to deepen, you begin to notice something even more subtle. Your inner world no longer reacts as strongly to absence. Where silence once felt heavy and personal, it starts to feel neutral. Where distance once triggered anxiety or overthinking, it now simply registers as information. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop interpreting every gap as a reflection of your worth. That shift alone changes the entire emotional landscape you've been living in. You also begin to see how much of your past emotional suffering was not created by love itself, but by ambiguity. The unclear signals, the inconsistent presence, the moments of warmth followed by withdrawal, all of it kept your mind in a constant state of emotional prediction. And prediction is exhausting when it has no stable pattern to rely on. Once you recognize this, you stop trying to mentally resolve what was never consistently expressed in reality. At the same time, your sense of emotional patience begins to transform. You are no longer willing to stay in situations where clarity is always delayed or postponed. Not from anger, but from understanding. You realize that waiting indefinitely for someone to become emotionally available often means postponing your own life in the process. And slowly, that realization becomes a quiet boundary within you. From here, your relationship with love becomes far more grounded. You no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety. You begin to recognize that the most meaningful connections are the ones that allow you to remain present in your own life while sharing space with someone else. And in that balance, you find something you may not have experienced before, love that adds to your peace instead of disrupting it. And when everything comes together, you start to see this entire experience in a completely different light. What once felt like confusion, emotional chaos, and deep longing slowly reveals itself as a process of learning yourself at a level you may never have accessed before. You were not just attached to a person. You were being guided into awareness of how you love, why you hold on, what you tolerate, and where you abandon yourself in the name of connection. And even though it may not have felt like it in the moment, every part of it was exposing something important within you that was ready to change. You begin to understand that not every strong feeling is meant to be acted on immediately. Sometimes strong feelings are meant to be understood first, because emotion without awareness can lead you into cycles that feel meaningful but leave you emotionally drained over time. And when you finally start observing your experience, instead of being fully consumed by it, you gain something powerful: perspective. You are no longer inside the storm trying to survive it. You are outside of it, seeing how it moves, how it pulls, and how it influences your decisions. And from that perspective, the most important realization slowly settles in. Love that is meant to support your growth will not require you to lose yourself in order to hold on to it. It will not make you constantly question your worth, your place, or your reality. It will not keep you suspended in emotional uncertainty where hope is the only thing keeping you engaged. Real love, the kind that is grounded and reciprocal, feels different. It feels stable even when it is imperfect. It allows space for honesty instead of confusion, presence instead of guessing, clarity instead of emotional survival mode. And one day, without forcing it, you will notice something quietly powerful has changed. The connection you once chased in confusion will no longer feel like something you need to chase at all. If it returns, it will only make sense if it returns with clarity, consistency, and mutual emotional presence. And if it does not, you will still be okay, because you will have built something within yourself that no absence can take away. This is the real ending of confusion and the beginning of emotional truth. Not the end of love, but the end of losing yourself in it. Trust the process, even when you cannot see it clearly. And if these words reached you, stay connected with Relationship Secrets, because this space is here to remind you that you were never alone in what you feel.